Good evening. Thank you for joining us.
Hi, Jerica.
Hi, how are you?
I'm good. How are you? Can you hear me?
I can.
Okay. Awesome. I'm trying to fix my screen, but we'll see. Okay, there we go. How are you today?
I am doing well. Happy New Year.
Happy New Year, indeed.
Yes. So hold on. I know we are, let me just try to get our other guest on, but good evening to everyone that has joined us. I'm really excited about tonight's conversation. It means a lot to me personally, and I know to a lot of the folks that have tuned in.
Hey.
Hey, how are you?
Good. How are y'all?
Good. Good. Hello.
You know, we're in 2022, so
we made it.
We made it. Well, now that we have both of our amazing guests on, why don't we jump into this conversation and get started? So good evening, and thank you to all of those of you who have joined us for tonight's Justice Now conversation, sponsored by the National Urban League. I am your host, Jerica Richardson, and I serve as the Senior Vice President for Equitable Justice and Strategic Initiatives at the National Urban League. So the title is a mouthful, but I think it's apropos because we are talking about an issue that I know so many of you all understand. It's one that is about equity and justice. And so we are talking about the student loan debt crisis, the challenges it poses for our community, and the steps you can take to prepare for May 1st. Yes, that's the big day when the federal student loan payments restart all over again. I know when we initially scheduled this show, we were looking at the beginning of the year or early on in the year for that restart. So many of us have gotten a reprieve, and I will say I'm personally thankful. Because look, we're in the middle of a pandemic. It's been rough. But I am so excited to have both of you ladies on with me because you both are amazing experts in the field. So let me just start out by introducing you to some of those folks who may not know you. First off, we have Kat Welbeck, and Kat is Director of Advocacy and Civil Rights Counsel at the Student Borrower Protection Center. Welcome, Kat.
Thank you. I'm so glad to be here.
And then we also have another familiar face for many in our movement, Ashley Harrington. Ashley is the Senior Advisor to the Chief Operating Officer at the Department of Education's Office of Federal Student Aid. I mean, her title says it right there, Federal Student Aid. We are all looking for aid in some way, shape, or form. So I'm just excited to have both of you join us this evening and really unpack all of this and provides, I think, really meaningful and helpful information to so many of us that find ourselves, still struggling and really figuring out how we reconcile our student loans. So before we jump into the conversation and start with a list of questions, I've been getting questions from everyone, so bear with me. I would love to give our viewers an opportunity to learn a little bit more about each of you. So if you could just take 1 or 2 minutes to talk about your background and your work in the space. And Ashley, why don't we start off with you?
Sure. Thank you. I'm really happy to be here, excited to talk to everybody and make sure you all have the information you need to navigate student loan repayment and about the recent changes. So I've been at Federal Student Aid for about 5 months now, serving as Senior Advisor. Prior to that, I was Director of Federal Advocacy and a Senior Policy Counsel at the Center for Responsible Lending, where we worked on all types of fair lending and consumer protection policies, from mortgages and payday lending to student loans. So really, though, the biggest part of my portfolio was on student loan debt. And at TRL, and even now, I always approach it as a racial justice issue. We know that Black people are more likely to borrow more, and struggle in repayment. And I personally have student loans. Everyone I know has student loans. So this, for me, is a very personal discussion and a very personal policy area. So I'm really excited to be here.
Well, thank you. We really appreciate you joining us. Kat?
Hello again, and thank you again, Jerica. Super excited to be here. Again, I'm Kat Welbeck. I'm Director of Advocacy and Civil Rights Counsel at the Student Borrower Protection Center. So we're a nonprofit advocacy organization that's solely focused on alleviating the student debt crisis. So we engage in a mix of advocacy, litigation strategy, and policy making, all aimed at, again, ending the student debt crisis. And then before joining that team, I was at the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau for about 5 years in our External Affairs Division. So I think seeing the breadth, I think one thing I loved about Ashley saying, again, talking about equity, talking about, the broad world of consumer finance and all these issues, how it all comes back to, again, like the racial wealth gap, equity, the way that wealth has been extracted from Black communities for like centuries. So really, really excited to be talking about student debt and be in this space because all of that work is so deeply intertwined. So glad that you're all having this conversation and happy to be having you with Ashley.
Well, thanks so much, Kat. And so I want you all to know that this is a free-flowing conversation. So if there's anything that one of our colleagues says on here, you can feel free to jump right in and chime in if there's anything you'd like to add. And to our viewers, I'm going to start us off with some of the big questions that I think folks tend to ask. But as we go through this conversation, please feel free to drop comments or questions in the chat, and I will do my absolute best to lift them up and make sure that our guests are able to answer them. So let's start out. My team did a little bit of digging and did a little research, and they brought back some numbers. So student loan debt totals right now, according to our research, are at $1.73 trillion across all borrowers. That number is staggering. So I think I would love to hear from you. Maybe Kat, start us off. What kind of borrowers owe the most and why?
And I think I love it. I think we kind of touched a bit on the framing, but I'll just go into it a little bit more. I think, what we see is really communities of color, particularly Black student loan borrowers, Latino student loan borrowers, and then particularly we're talking about the borrowers who have the most student loan debt, me being one of them, Black women really carry a lot of this burden. And I think it's really important, it's a $1.7 trillion crisis with 45 million people touching all corners of this country. But really, when we're talking about who's really bearing the brunt of this crisis, it's the same borrowers who are disproportionately affected by the racial wealth gap, right? So we think about the ways that communities have faced, centuries, particularly the Black communities face centuries of discrimination in terms of access to wealth. So whether it's, being redlined out of communities, facing discrimination in other forms of mortgage lending, small business lending, facing employment discrimination, all of these things don't operate in a vacuum. They all, again, contribute to this huge wealth gap that we have in our country. So what we see is when Black and Latino students go to school, they end up taking on more debt than their white peers, graduate with more debt, and then that cuts into the wealth building opportunities. And so you really see how this cuts across generations and becomes a terrible reinforcing cycle.
Thank you for that. I think the cycle is really key because I'm sure as so many of us growing up, our communities, our families, everyone has pushed education and higher education for so many of us being the opportunity to really lift oneself up, lift one's family up, and really to achieve the American dream. And so we've done the work. So many of us have, crossed that line. I think all three of us on here are probably dealing with law school debt in some form or another, right? I mean, it's a huge hurdle, but it almost seems counterintuitive that we do what we're told, we invest in our education but at the end of the day, it's almost like being able to attain that life, that livelihood that one aspired to becomes difficult because you're mired in debt. And so we talked a little bit about the borrowers. Ashley, I saw a question pop up, and both of you can jump in. We're going to spend most of our conversation talking about federal student loans, but I don't want to be dismissive of the note about private student loans. And I mean, we've seen historically over the years that has been a conversation. We've also seen that for many folks, the lending, space has almost been predatory, or there's some schools where you're going and you're getting the education, but and taking out all these loans, but you're not actually getting the jobs that would pay this off. I just want to open the floor up to see if there's anything either of you want to contribute about kind of the history and the struggle with private student loans, and what the government has done to try to alleviate any of that over the years.
Absolutely. So federal student aid, we really do focus on the federal loans, but I think what we've been looking at is when we think about accountability, right? You're right. So many of these schools, these predatory for-profit institutions in particular, right? Many of them have loans, private loans associated with their schools, their other problems. So we're thinking about accountability and how we make sure that our institutions, our servicers, all of our stakeholders in the student loan space know that there is accountability, that we're putting borrowers first, and we're going to be looking at what you are doing, which protections you have in place or don't have in place, how you're engaging. I know the CFPB has recently, confirmed what many of us have known all along, that ISAs, income share agreements, which is a new form of loan products that many of us are seeing, are also loans, and they're also going to make sure that they're providing oversight. So I think it goes back to accountability and oversight in the private student loan market. And I think, Kat can talk more about other policy solutions, but what we can do is make sure on the things that we have oversight for and the institutions that we work with and the stakeholders that we work with, they know that we are putting borrowers first.
And just to piggyback off Ashley, I love talking about the accountability piece. And again, private student loans, they're private companies. So, Ashley's talking about mostly the federal student loan space. But one thing we do push with private student loans is really in terms of pushing that accountability is looking into states, right? So both Ashley mentioned the CFPB, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, and the role of the federal government looking at accountability for private lenders. And really, one thing that we've seen more recently, like she said, is the CFPB taking a more rigorous approach to actually looking at these practices, right? But also looking at the roles that states have, right? So we have state legislators that can be passing legislation to also push laws to make sure that private student lenders are held accountable. Schools, like Ashley was mentioning, for-profit schools that provide their own financing, often via expensive private student loans, are held accountable and ensuring that there are these standards across the board. So I think, agree. I think there's a common theme of accountability, but also knowing that we should be pushing at every level of government possible to ensure that all of these lenders, all of these products that try to claim they're not lenders, income share agreements, are being held to account.
Thank you for that. So I'm going to throw out a few more numbers. So 4 years after graduation, 48% of Black students owe an average of 12.5% more than they even borrowed from the beginning. Let's talk about why this is happening and what can be done. And I'll ask Ashley, what is being done at the system level to really address this problem?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a real problem. And I think it goes back to the racial wealth gap that we were talking about earlier, right? I like to say for so many Black folks, because of student loans, even though they pursued higher education, we have middle-class incomes, but can't live middle-class lifestyle, right? Because so much of our money is going towards paying our student loans. And even when we're on income-based repayment, right, which Black folks are most likely to be on, and it's a great way to help you manage your loans. And I encourage everyone to make sure you're on the best repayment plan for you. We can talk about that later, right? The flip side of that is for many folks on IBR, while they're managing their loans, they're watching their balances grow because their payments aren't covering the interest, right? So and it can be very disheartening, right? That you're making payments every month and you're watching that balance grow. You're watching that principal not go down. You're not even covering that. So I think why we see that happen is because we had to take out so much to begin with. And then as we're trying to manage our loans, even if we're making payments, we're not able to pay them down. And so that's why you see these levels continue to go up. And that extends for not just those first few years. This goes on for decades. There was a study a while back that talked about how for the typical Black borrower, 20 years into repayment, they still owe 95% of their original balance. And for the typical white borrower, they had paid off 96% of their original balance. And it all goes back to, we don't have that foundation of wealth, that intergenerational wealth. We've never been allowed to build it. And that stops us from being able to do these other things, including more effectively manage our student loans.
Thank you for all of that context. I think it's helpful in really allowing us to understand the scope of the problem. I'm sure so many of the folks that have tuned in may have been on the front lines or have had friends that were on the front lines when we're talking about the 2020 election and protesting a whole host of issues on the social justice and equity front. And for many Americans, you know, student loans and really how much it has hampered our growth and in society, that was one of the major issues that drove a lot of people to the polls. So, Kat, I know you work in the advocacy space, so I really want you to give us an honest assessment of kind of where we've been and where we're going. In your opinion, what actions has the current administration really taken to address the student loan issues thus far?
As the advocate, I'm going to start with what the administration has done, and like huge shout out to Ashley and FSA, and then obviously the
hiring Ashley like, was a good start.
And Ashley already knows where I'm going with what we need to do. But honestly, I think one thing that is amazing is that having an administration that is listening to the voices of borrowers this summer. And obviously Ashley can talk much more about this because she was, you know, deeply involved in these efforts and making these changes. But the Department of Education was saying, you know, how can we improve, for example, the public service loan forgiveness program? And so borrowers from across the country, for those of you who are familiar with government RFIs, they do not get many comments. Like it's not like a source of interest for many people, but over 50,000 people said, we're going to tell our story, or nearly 50,000 people told the Department of Education, we're going to tell our story about public service loan forgiveness, not getting access to the program in the way that we should. And then amazingly, there's been this temporary waiver for a year to broaden who has access to this program, to allow people who previously have been denied PSLF and people who, you know, due to some, you know, servicing failures, you know, people who've been in public service for 10 years plus, or, you know, for many years and not getting payments counted, really being able to open the gates to those people. And so, like, I really commend the Department of Education for taking, like, really listening to the voices of borrowers, taking this seriously, and really providing an avenue to relief for student loan borrowers. And now with my advocacy hat, I think with everything that we said, one thing I would love to see the administration do, and I think I saw it in some earlier comments, was talking about canceling this debt. I think we've all kind of, you know, talked about, you know, the equity issues with student debt, how these are all rooted in systemic racism, right? And in the fact that, you know, Black people and Black communities have, like, historically and continue to be denied equitable opportunities to build wealth. So I think the first way you correct that is say, you know what? We know that this crisis is, you know, hinged on bad policy that we've had for centuries and that we continue to perpetuate. So let's fix this, right? And so the first way to fix this, let's wipe the slate clean, right? So let's look at these cancellation options and then talk about how do we rebuild. And we'll talk about Build Back Better. How do we build back better our student loan system in a way that it's affordable, right? So Ashley's talking about IDR, again, in a very real way that's not necessarily affordable. How do we then look at the other repayment programs? How do we fix these things so that we're not recreating these other problems? How do we make college more affordable? Like, all these things go into this larger fix. But I think the first thing you have to do is to say, we're giving people an opportunity to build wealth in communities in the ways that we've been denied the entire time that we've been in this country. So, but I really do want to give a shout out to the changes that we have seen at the Department of Education so far.
Well, let's dive in a little bit deeper to public service loan forgiveness, because I know a lot of folks that have tuned in either work in the government space or in the nonprofit space and have been just trying to figure this out. I mean, I remember maybe a few months ago, someone posted on Facebook in my network that they had their loans forgiven, and everyone was like, what? How did you figure it out? I've been trying to do this for 10 and 15 years. And so we've seen the 60 Minutes reports, we've seen some of the pieces on NPR. And, you know, I really want to break down what some of the challenges have been for, you know, borrowers and those who have, you know, applied for PSLF, who have been denied. You know, Ashley, if you could talk a little bit about what those gaps were in the system, and in real specific terms, what how they have been alleviated and what are some of the changes to make the system a little bit easier for folks. We know absolutely it's not perfect, and we can't wash away everything that has happened before, but I do think everyone that is tuned in has a real opportunity to really see things made good on their end for a system that they have been participating in.
Yes, Jerica, it's really exciting, right? It's really exciting to be a part of an administration that really is putting borrowers first and trying to make programs that have not worked for so long actually work for borrowers. We are actually delivering on the promise of public service loan forgiveness. And it's even more important right now in the midst of this pandemic, when we know so many of the public service workers are the ones on the front lines. And so these are the ones that we really want to make sure have access to the program. And so, the public service, the premise behind it was simple, right? You do 10 years of public service at a state or local government or a federal government job or at a nonprofit. And at the end of that 10 years, you stay in repayment and you get the rest of your loans forgiven. Unfortunately, there was so much fine print. There was so much that that borrowers weren't aware of for various reasons. What type of loan you have to have, what type of repayment plan you need to be on, what did it mean to make a qualifying payment, what was a qualifying employer. And so there were so many pain points that borrowers were experiencing, and no one was able to get relief, right? People had been in public service for 10 years, for more than 10 years, and they weren't able to access this relief that so many had been counting on. And so we really have worked to fix a number of those things. We introduced a limited waiver in early October, and it hits a couple of those pain points. There are still other pain points that are out there. There are rulemakings going on, so I won't really touch on that, but I want people to know about the waiver because it is time limited. So one of the biggest issues is that a lot of people out here have FFEL loans, federal family education loans. They don't have direct loans, but PSLF is only for direct loans. And so you would get all the way to the 10 years and realize you weren't able to get credit for any of those payments that you made, or you consolidated and you weren't able to get credit for any of those payments before consolidation. We've changed that. That's not the case anymore. If you have FFEL loans, if you have consolidated loans, you can get PSLF credit. But to do that, if you still have FFEL loans, you're going to have to consolidate into the direct loan program before October 31st, 2022. October 31st, 2022. I want people to hear me because this is time limited. You're also going to have to submit at least one PSLF form, and that's where you certify a qualifying employer. And we're also looking at, some people may have not gotten credit for a payment because they were like $1 off or 10 cents off even, right? And so we're changing that. Now you will get credit for all of your periods of repayment. If you were in repayment, not in default, not in forbearance, unless it's the current COVID forbearance, not in a deferment, you will get credit for that time. So we are going back to our own system and finding those borrowers, and then we're sending that over, and we're working with our Fed loan servicing, which is the PSLF servicer, to make sure borrowers get credit for all of that time. So the steps that borrowers need to take is find out what type of loans you have. Go to studentaid.gov, log in. If you have FFEL loans, if you don't have direct loans, you need to consolidate. And then you need to submit your PSLF form. There's this handy tool on studentaid.gov. It's called the PSLF Help Tool. It will help you generate a form. It has a lot of employers that are qualifying employers already in there. All employers are not in there. I want people to hear me. We did not do anything on the qualifying employer rules. So you still have to be employed by the federal government, state government, local government, or a nonprofit. But we do have a great database, but everything's not in there. So if you don't see your employer in there, that they still could be a PSLF employer, but you got to get that in. You got to get that in before October 31st, 2022, so that you can take advantage of this waiver.
So I think you lifted up a very important point, because I've spent the past several months going back to all of my old employers and feeling, having them, the tool is very helpful. So I do encourage folks to go to studentaid.gov and reaching out to get them, to really fill out the paperwork and certify it so that I can send it back in and get credit for those years I tried to get credit for and then I was denied. And so Ashley, I think the other point that you brought up about the repayment plans, and there are so many different repayment plans, and if you weren't in the correct ones, then you did not get credit. And so I have seen in the midst of me adding and certifying that I'm starting to get credit and showing that I'm qualifying in places where I would not have before under the old terms. So I do want to encourage folks that if you invest the time and the energy, I know you've already invested 4 years, 10 years, 6 years, just getting the degrees to begin with. That is worth the effort. This is something that we cannot let pass us by as a community. It's something that can be life-changing if folks are really able to take advantage of it. But we have to work and do our part to make it happen. And to ask the questions, fill out the forms, and stay on top of things. I also know that there are folks that have current, right now are dealing with certain lenders, but some of that may change. Correct, Ashley?
Yes.
So we want to be transparent with folks, and so they know how much they really need to focus on this, and so they don't slip through the cracks again, because we wouldn't want that to happen.
Absolutely. So I'm glad you're starting to see changes. So, but to that point, I want to make sure everyone knows it's going to take time. I have to say that, because I think this is not going to happen overnight. There's a lot of process pieces involved. So give us the time to get your accounts right. And if you still, in a few months, several months down the road, feel like there's still something wrong with your account, there will be a process to get your your application reconsidered. So that is in the works. But we are committed to making sure that everybody who's eligible has access to it. In terms of the transfers that you're talking, we are experiencing a series of transfers between loan servicers, where there are a few loan servicers who are exiting the federal loan servicing market. And one of those servicers is Fed Loan Servicing, who is the PSLF servicer. However, they are still finishing out the PSLF. Transfers take a while, so you should still submit things as normal. When it's time for your loan to be transferred, you will get communication from your current servicer. You'll get communication from your new servicer. You'll get communication from us at FSA. You will know about where your loans are going, and you will get information. But for right now, continue to follow the instruction that you're given. But you want to make sure your information is up to date on studentaid.gov. You want to make sure your information is up to date with your current servicer, so that you are always getting the most up-to-date information for yourself, and so that we are able to communicate with you effectively. So yes, these things are happening. We're doing a lot of things simultaneously, right? We're preparing to return borrowers to repayment at May. We're doing these PSLF changes. We're transitioning to different servicers. But at the center of that is we're really trying to make sure that nobody slips through the cracks. And so there will be opportunities to raise your hand if that does happen.
Thank you. I think that's good to know. And we will definitely check back in with you when that piece happens, because we want to make sure that folks are able to catch up and really have an opportunity for redress if they're having problems with the system. Kat, I want to turn it back to you. We focused on PSLF, but what are other areas of reform that would make student loans more manageable?
I know I already said cancellation, but I feel obligated, Jerica, to say it one more time. But I want everyone to know, when I say like cancellation, I mean it's twofold, right? So there's the first to say like, let's fix this playing field. We know that we've messed up in a very large way, in the way that, having a debt field finance, higher education finance system, right? In the way that we know the racial wealth gap creates disparate balances, all of those things, right? So cancellation is a means to say, like, even the way that existing programs previously operated, right? Like, those didn't work previously until we had administration that said, hey, we haven't eared the borrowers, let's fix this, right? So cancellation is a way of saying, one, we've kind of made some mistakes in the past, let's fix this. Let's really do bold policy in the same way that discrimination was the nation's policy. Like, let's make equitable policy that helps people, right? So like, that's one thing. But how do you keep this problem from happening? You create programs that continue to work for borrowers and make sure that borrowers can afford their payments, and have access to relief throughout their time with student debt. So whether that's public service loan forgiveness, making sure that people who commit 10 years of service to their country get the promise of relief that's something that we're seeing right now, and that's amazing. And so to continue to see that kind of improvement. Income-driven repayment, I think Ashley hit on a really, really big point. Again, talking about the difference between income and wealth, particularly in the Black community, right? Like you can have, like she said, a middle-class income, but that's not the same as wealth because, again, you're paying so much to student debt because of all these other reasons that we've laid out before, right? So can we have an income-driven repayment system that, one, where you're not just paying less than your actual principal and just paying on part of your interest and your balance grows? Is there a way that we can think about reimagining IDR? So one, that the payments are, one, more affordable monthly for borrowers, but two, can we think about ways where we reimagine how interest accrues, right? Can we think about what does free college look like? What does free community college look like? What are ways that we can make sure that we're not pulling wealth out of communities and we're committing wealth to, like we're committing resources to them? It is a policy choice not to commit to higher education. It's a policy choice to say that we don't want to help borrowers who are struggling with debt for a problem that we know that we've previously created. And so I think cancellation is that first piece of like, let's kind of like wipe this slate and kind of figure things out. And I think then the next step is let's fix existing programs. And I think that's something we've seen, right? During the payment pause, we're seeing these programs being fixed while borrowers are not simultaneously making payments in a program that we've acknowledged is fundamentally broken. And so I think that's also something really important when we think about this time right now and seeing really meaningful changes to our student loan system.
Thank you for that. Ashley, is there anything you want to add in the reform space? Are there any conversations that are happening in Washington beyond PSLF and that you can share, things that, you know, folks really need to be keeping an eye out? We want to understand where the conversation is going, and not just for ourselves, but we also recognize there's a whole nother crop and generations of students that are coming behind us that really have been relying on student loans.
Absolutely. So we just wrapped up one session of negotiated rulemaking where we are looking at income-based repayment. We're looking at borrower defensive repayment. We're looking at second chance Pell. We're looking at all of these different programs and finding other ways that we can better support borrowers and make these programs work for more borrowers and more stakeholders. So that was one session. Another table will be starting soon, and then we're looking at and then the regulation process will continue. It's kind of a long process, but please stay tuned for that. But this is not the end. We are really committed again to making sure that these programs work. And so we're finding ways, and we want to hear from borrowers. We want to hear from stakeholders. We want to know where the pain points are, where you're still having issues, and we're looking at how we can make this better. We know things are not perfect. We know that there is a lot of room for improvement, and we are interested in planning to do that. But it takes time. Work with us. You know, we came into it's a $1.7 trillion crisis, and it took a long time to build, and we got to work at it all together.
Thank you for that. I think we've gotten, really great nuggets from you all how to as individuals really look into this issue and try to find recourse for ourselves. But I have to go back to advocacy because this is a National Urban League and policy. We talk about turning our protests into policy. But how can borrowers become advocates? What can they effectively do to push for change, not just for themselves, but the overarching system? Kat?
Cherokee, I love that question. I think, honestly, and it's one thing that Ashley just said, make your voice heard. And I think, Cherokee, you're talking about something earlier, how many people went to the polls because they said this was an issue that mattered to them, right? I think one thing that's hard to even process now, in 2022, if you asked me 2.5 years ago, if student debt, the idea of canceling student debt, the idea of racial equity in the student debt crisis and reforming the student loan system would be something that was even on the table, I would be okay. I wouldn't even take you seriously. It wasn't a real conversation, but people said this matters, right? People went to the polls. People are continuing to keep this conversation going. Jericho, you all are hosting this event, and I think that's what's so important. And for everyone here who's engaged on this issue, you have to keep engaging. Letting your elected officials know this matters to you. When there's a tweet storm, tweet, talk about it. When you see an event about student debt, like, share with your friends, join, talk about these issues, because really when we elevate our voices, this is when we've seen change. Ashley's talking to you about all these changes that they're doing at the Department of Education right now. It is because we've heard so many voices. Not only do we have an administration that has their ears to the people, but like, because people then said, this is what we need. These are the programs that we want changes to. So like, again, please make your voice heard, engage, because I think we've just come so far in this conversation and even the space and what we're talking about as meaningful changes in student debt, because people said this matters. And I think we just got to continue to do it as much as we can to really make our voices heard.
I think that's great. And it just reminds me of where we started out early in this conversation, where Ashley talked about accountability, right? And so, yes, we need to hold those in government accountable, but accountability is also on us. We elect folks. We know that there are systems, there are promises that are made, and we need to continue to support people who are invested in making sure that those promises are kept. There are slates of elected officials or candidates for office that have made this, part of their platform. These are the people we need to look more into. These are the people we need to read more about and educate ourselves in. And one of the things the National Urban League has done on the civil rights front, on the justice front, is we've created a civil rights scorecard where we can speak out and plainly say what lawmakers, irrespective of party, have done or have not done, who have spoken out, stood up, or pushed for certain policies that we know our communities have been advocating for and care about. So I think, there is an onus and responsibility on us. Yes, pursue changes and pursue recourse for yourself. But we shouldn't just think about ourselves. We should think about our broader community. And we should think about all of our children. Hopefully I hope to be a mom one day, and I don't want my child mired in this debt. We need to be thinking about the next generation. We have the opportunity to shape policy now. So we need to get involved. We need to educate ourselves. We need to have these conversations. And we really need to insist on those seeking higher office or seeking reelection that they make this issue a priority. If we're quiet, we're not going to see the change. And so, I just want to commend you both for the work you do. I want to say thank you for your service. I totally believe you deserve to have your loans repaid because you have been working hard on behalf of all of us. So before we close, I would just love to give you each a few minutes just to share some final words, some thoughts, or any advice that you may have for our audience. I mean, this has been such a really inspiring and great learning experience for me, having you all on. And, we hope to be able to bring you all back because we know, as Ashley said, this is not something that's going to change overnight. We need to stay on top of this issue and really invest and do the work to make sure that all of our communities are really left whole and get the promise that we've invested in. So who wants to go first?
Well, I'll just say, reminder about this limited waiver. If you're trying to get PSLF, please do what you need to do. Consolidate, apply by October 31st. Also, we are preparing for loan repayments to restart. We are excited that it has been extended to May 1st, but it is coming. And so there are things you need to do in the meantime. Again, go to studentaid.gov, look at repayment plans, find out what makes sense for you, find out when your due date is, find out who your servicer is, and just make sure that you are as informed as possible and looking at what makes the most sense for you. There are going to be a lot of changes that are happening across the board, but your best place to start is studentaid.gov and finding out what's going on with your loans and your account.
Thank you for that, Ashley. Such important information. So I hope you all are really listening, but know this will be reposted on the National Urban League site. So if you missed any part of the conversation, you can go back to our Instagram page. It'll also be on YouTube. There are so many gems in this conversation, so I want to make sure you all don't miss it. Kat, why don't you close us out?
Oh, wow. Okay. Well, no rush or anything. I'm definitely going to say cancellation again just for the sake of it because that's all I love to talk about. But really, I just really want to echo what Ashley said. I think, with my advocate hat on, going to push for, again, make your voice heard. keep student debt in the conversation. Like any chance you get, like talk about why this matters to you, why we need to like have changes to the student debt system. But at the same time, as much as I want to put on my advocacy hat, talk about like cancel debt, extend the payment pause until we make sure we fix the repayment system, all of those things is really important to, like, again, echo everything Ashley said. We can advocate as much as we need to make our voices heard, but please, please, please be prepared for the return to repayment whenever it happens. So just in your mind, be ready for May 1st. And again, like Ashley said, this PSLF waiver is an absolutely phenomenal opportunity for those who've worked in public service and think they may have previously, missed out on payments for, like, just small administrative errors, whatever it may have been. But yes, so keep advocating, keep up the good fight on getting this debt canceled, but please, please do listen to all this amazing advice that Ashley gave about making sure that you have everything set for return to repayment and accessing public service loan forgiveness.
Thank you so much, Kat. And let me just reiterate, as Kat said, we're not waiting till May 1st. Go to studentaid.gov. Start looking at it now. You all have invested in these expensive educations, and it's time to put them to use to make sure that you are able to really execute on this and really take advantage of the opportunities that have been put out there. With that, I just want to thank you all for joining us. Many thanks to Kat and Ashley for sharing such valuable information. And a reminder to everyone that tuned in, remember the time for justice is always now. And so let's do the work. Accountability is on us. And let's really make the system work and show up for us in the way it should. Thank you all and Happy New Year.
Thank you. Bye.